Most people agree we all have divine rights, sacred rights that cannot be taken from us. The right to free expression, the right to peaceably assemble, the right to access water, the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness without undue interference from any person or organization. But there's another right we often forget, the right to be safe in our persons and property. This right, which is enshrined in many historical documents, including the United States Constitution's Bill of Rights, is one of the most important human rights, and here's why. Our world is becoming increasingly unpredictable. Widespread psychiatric drug use, violent video games, and violent TV and Hollywood movie programming have caused rare but devastating outbreaks of extreme violence among imbalanced individuals. The psychiatric drugs commonly prescribed to our troubled youth, and increasingly to our active duty soldiers as well, have well-known and widely documented side effects of promoting both suicides and violent behavior. That violence, as we saw in the Columbine shootings of 1999, sometimes comes at a catastrophic cost to society. In the world of nature, the right to self-defense is widely practiced. It is, in fact, built right into the DNA of countless species of plants and animals. Thousands of varieties of cacti, for example, have protective spines, plant weapons, if you will, which teach predators to leave them alone. A porcupine has spines that puncture the flesh of would-be attackers and then hang on, resisting removal and causing painful irritations that teach predators to look elsewhere for food. Turtles carry robust defensive shells with them as they go about their lives, and many species of insects actually launch chemical weapons at attackers as a form of self-defense. As reported in Wikipedia, the bombardier beetle uses a violent exothermic chemical reaction to launch a boiling, noxious chemical spray in a rapid burst of pulses from special glands in its abdomen, accompanied with a popping sound. The Oogpeister beetle will fire formic acid at attackers. The devil rider stick insects can fire terpenes from glands on the metathorax that can cause an intense burning irritation of the eyes and mouth of potential predators. Wood ants will spray acid at attackers. Some diptodactyline geckos can fire a black or pale yellow sticky fluid out of glands in their tail for a distance of about a meter and with good aim. Spitting cobra can squirt venom from forward-facing holes in its fangs. It aims for the eyes, spitting up to 1.5 meters. The venom may cause blindness. A bird that uses liquid projectiles in defense is the southern great petrel, which produces a stomach oil made up of wax esters and triglycerides that is stored in the proventriculus and can be projectile vomited on predators. Some New World tarantulas have a dense covering of hairs called urticating hairs on the abdomen that they sometimes use as protection against enemies. Species with urticating hairs can kick these hairs off. They are flicked into the air at a target using their back pairs of legs. These fine hairs are barbed and designed to irritate and can be lethal to small animals such as rodents. The California ground squirrel is known to distract predators such as the rattlesnake and gopher snake from locating their nest burrows by kicking sand into their eyes. A wild female African elephant has also been observed to throw various material at an interfering rhino. Some primates, including humans, of course, can throw objects such as rocks, sticks, and even feces as projectiles. Primates that can throw are humans, bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, capuchins, and certain gibbons, and perhaps even some baboons. A chimpanzee in a Swedish zoo was observed to stockpile stones, yes, stockpiling ammo, to be used as missiles against visitors. Why is all this important? Because government officials and world leaders increasingly say they want the human species to be defenseless against predators. The effort to disarm the human population is, at its core, a violation of both a divine right as well as the natural world. Throughout nature, we observe plants, insects, and animals exercising their right to self-defense, including the use of projectiles hurled at would-be attackers. That right is a reflection of natural law, and it is as important to the future of humanity as any other human right, including the right to free speech, the right to freely travel, and the right to pursue happiness. But among all human rights, the divine right of self-defense is arguably becoming the most important right of all. Why? Because governments everywhere, at both the local and national levels, are cutting back on budgets for peace officers. The very idea of having peace officers on the streets is that regular people could delegate their divine right of self-defense to a group of specialists. If you have an emergency requiring defensive action, for example, you dial 911.
Hurry, he's getting in.
To call these specialists, also known as police, to arrive at your location and deal with the threat for you. But as more and more cities are headed into financial bankruptcy due to runaway debt spending, they are sharply cutting back on peace officers. 911 response times keep getting longer and longer. Even violent crimes don't earn an immediate response. It can often take 5, 10, or even 20 minutes for a peace officer to arrive on the scene, even though many violent crimes, such as shootings, are over and done with in 2 to 3 minutes. The need for individual self-defense is greater now than ever before. While the Aurora, Colorado Batman movie theater massacre proved that local police cannot protect you, Hurricane Katrina proved that the federal government can't protect you either. In the aftermath of that natural disaster, unarmed, defenseless citizens were repeatedly robbed, looted, and even raped by violent criminals. This was made worse by a military-led door-to-door gun confiscation effort that left many citizens defenseless against predators. Many New Orleans peace officers actually abandoned their duties to go home and protect their own families, and some were even shown in the TV news looting retail stores.
Chris, go ahead. You were describing how you and your team were kicking in doors and confiscating firearms from people. Did anybody resist? Did anybody ever shoot back? What happened?
Well, we had a couple of people resist verbally, and they got stuffed and cuffed very violently. We throw them in the back of the 5-ton or the deuce and a half or whatever, and then we take them out to the Greyhound bus station, which was the police station at the time.
But how did you and your team justify to yourselves and each other that gun confiscation would help this situation when it was a free-for-all? I mean, isn't that a time when citizens need to be able to defend themselves?
It never, like I said, I was just ignorant as hell. And that's kind of something that I worry about with the kids today, if they really realize what they're doing. I had no idea. The only time it ever occurred to me that something may be wrong is we came up, we were down by the old French district. We came up to this man's house. He had a big wooden sign that says, "I'm here alone with my dog and my shotgun. Looters beware." We thought, it's funny. Everyone stopped and took pictures of the sign. But eventually we took his guns.
Jeez.
And we left him there with nothing.
So now that you know what you know, now that you're listening to the Alex Jones Show and you're informed, what would you advise people to do if this happens again?
What do you do when they stack right? You know what I mean? And they're prepped to come into the home. There's no negotiating with us. Trust me. There was no negotiating.
Yeah.
If you resisted, you died. That were the orders. You go after gun or you die.
It is becoming increasingly clear that the task of protecting yourself, your children, your family, and even your local community will fall onto your shoulders. The theory of delegating security to a group of specialists called peace officers is failing. For this reason, more and more citizens are choosing to take responsibility for their own protection. And following in the footsteps of Mother Nature, they are acquiring mechanisms that hurl projectiles at high speed in order to stop aggressors and predators. Along with the divine right of self-defense comes the divine responsibility to de-escalate violence at every opportunity. Those who understand connection to spirit and who live by a code of ethics neither seek out violence nor create violence themselves. They avoid conflict. They swallow their pride. They turn the other cheek. This should be the goal of all responsible citizens, but especially those who choose to be armed for the purpose of safety and community defense. The most responsible citizen of all is one who despises violence, and yet is willing to unleash it upon an aggressor in order to save the lives of innocent children or other would-be victims. A firearm is a mechanical tool that launches small projectiles at high speed, much like the mechanisms we see in insects and animals described earlier. The ethics of choosing to deploy such a system are embodied in the intent and the context of the situation. Is it justifiable to cause extreme physical trauma and even death to a psychotic shooter who has already killed innocent people and seems intent on shooting more? Nearly everyone would agree the answer is yes. But here's the part that confuses some people who don't engage in clear thinking. If that answer is yes, then it must be yes regardless of whether the act was carried out by a peace officer or by a private citizen. If shooting a dangerous psychopathic killer is the right thing to do in the protection of innocent life, then it is the right thing for anyone to do. It cannot be selectively right for some people while selectively wrong for others. Peace officers, after all, are merely citizens who have been granted special permission by the people to become specialists in keeping the peace through the use, when necessary, of firearms. Such delegation of power does not revoke it from those who delegated it in the first place. Porcupines are alive today because they carry spines. Skunks survive because they can launch highly offensive chemical weapons at predators. Without these defenses, porcupines and skunks would be extinct. It is their defenses that give them the opportunity to live, to prosper, to have their own children, and to bring into the world their next generation. For animals and plants throughout the natural world, the divine right of self-defense is equivalent to the right to live. In the world of humans, the United Nations, the global governance group attempting to take control over all nations, laws, and regulations, promotes what it calls its Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It declares that everyone has a right to life, liberty, and, quote, security of person, but it interprets security as that which is provided by the state, not an individual right. Even if the right to security of person were interpreted as an individual right, which it is not, Article 29 of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights negates all other rights and freedoms outlined in the previous 28 articles by saying, quote, "These rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations." In other words, if the purpose of the United Nations is decided to be total global domination over the people of planet Earth, then all rights that are contrary to that purpose are immediately null and void in the eyes of the UN, including the divine right of self-defense. As it turns out, local governments, national governments, and especially the United Nations actively seek to violate the laws of nature and restrict the individual right of self-defense. They want you, the individual, to be defenseless so that you are forced to rely on them, the government, for your protection. This is similar to the way in which the medical establishment wants people to be ignorant of the curative power of nutrition. Vitamin D halts nearly 80% of all cancers, for example, so that the population remains enslaved to a monopoly of medicine that profits the drug industry. Everywhere in our world, there are corporate forces and government forces that wish to isolate people from knowledge, from rights, and from awareness of those things which would empower them. The gun restriction debate is itself a mind trick. Gun restriction laws are not actually gun restrictions on everyone. They are only gun restrictions on private citizens, so that gun concentration places a monopoly of force in the hands of the government. The gun restriction debate is itself a mind trick. Gun restriction laws are not actually gun restrictions on everyone. They are only gun restrictions on private citizens, so that gun concentration places a monopoly of force in the hands of the government. This is anti-democratic, for starters. A democracy is based on the fundamental concept that a distribution of power among the many creates a better society. It is the concentration of power among the few, such as what we see in a dictatorship, that leads to corruption and exploitation of the people. Yet the gun restriction debate is essentially a gun monopoly, a gun dictatorship push that seeks to create a government monopoly over firearms. This is a violation of the very tenets of a democratic and fair society. In this way, people who are anti-gun have been tricked by gun restriction politics. A true global anti-gun movement would see governments abandoning the use of force against the people. The armed raids on California raw milk producers, for example, or the use of guns to force parents to vaccinate their children against their will, are all the result of a monopoly of force in the hands of the government. When the government wants to force people to do what it wants, it uses guns. This force will only become more aggressive, more tyrannical, and more dangerous if the imbalance of power is swayed in the government's favor through disarmament of the citizens. The crux of the anti-gun movement, you see, is not to disarm the government. It is to selectively disarm private citizens only, therefore granting what is called a monopoly of violence to the government itself. This is openly revealed as the true purpose of gun restrictions and disarmament legislation: to monopolize the use of force into the hands of the government itself, to hold the people of the world in a perpetual state of surrender to those who control the guns, the governments. And when that happens, history has shown that a monopoly of force often ends in mass murder. In just the last century, armed governments possessing a monopoly on gun control have directly killed over 250 million people on our planet. R.J. Rummel at the University of Hawaii has extensively studied what's called democide, the term describing death by government. According to his extensive research through over 8,000 reports of government-caused deaths, Rummel estimates that there have been 262 million victims of democide in the last century. That's 6 times as many people have died from government-inflicted murder than have died in battle. In other words, if you think war is bad, a monopoly of violence in the hands of government is far worse. If all these bodies, 262 million people, were laid head to toe, with the average height being 5 feet, Rummel estimates they would circle the earth 10 times. This is the body count of gun control. It is the inevitable result of disarming the citizens. When the people cannot defend themselves, the monopolistic power of government sooner or later slips into the hands of a psychopathic tyrant who uses that power to commit genocide. Just as porcupines would be extinct today if they did not have spines, the citizens of America today will soon become victims of government genocide, dubbed population reduction, if they do not retain their own power to launch small projectiles at high speed in a common defense of life and liberty. And because the right to self-defense is a divine right, those who act to erode or nullify such a right are acting in violation of nature and in violation of our Creator. Those who support gun disarmament in any nation do so blindly, creating for themselves the precise conditions that will someday be used by their own governments to murder them. Aurora, Colorado, the site of the Batman movie massacre of 2012, has some of the strongest gun restrictions of any city in the country. One reason the shooter there was able to kill 12 and wound another 58 people is because concealed carry weapons are banned in Aurora. Any citizen who might have fought back with a firearm in the defense of innocent children would have been arrested and charged with felony crimes. This is the ultimate effect of gun control laws: to criminalize those who serve in the protection of life while doing little to stop the psychopathic, violent criminals who, by definition, do not abide by gun restriction laws. In banning concealed carry weapons in the hands of legal and lawful owners in their city, Aurora officials created precisely the conditions that allowed a massacre to result in a large body count. They forced the citizens to be defenseless, even while knowing their own police forces could not provide protection to everyone. Aurora may, in fact, have been selected by the shooter precisely because the city's gun restriction laws would practically guarantee a disarmed crowd. Laws that ban concealed carry, it turns out, create what might be called a hunting preserve for psychopaths. I will end this piece with a prayer. May we forever be blessed with the gift of living in an age of peace and sanity and personal responsibility. And yet, should such ideals fail to be embraced by individuals who depart from the realm of rationality, I pray that we may always value, protect, and retain our right to reluctantly but decisively engage in acts of self-defense that protect our persons, our children, our families, and our communities. May we be protected and blessed in our intention to demand the democratic distribution of power that leads to peace. And may we always resist tyranny, the concentration of power in the hands of tyrants, and the prevention of the mass murder of innocents that such concentration of power inevitably produces. I pray that we live in a world where we carry tools of self-defense and yet never need to use them. I pray that we see through the propaganda and the deception of citizen disarmament politics, and that we never again allow our fellow human beings, our brothers and sisters across the planet of every race, color, and religion, to be marched into slaughter zones, into gas chambers, into waiting pits, disarmed and defenseless against government gone bad. In the long run, the protection of innocent life depends on us collectively and for the greater good honoring the individual right to self-defense. Amen.
The fewer guns we have in the world, the better it is for mankind.
They are as determined as ever.
Mr. Chairman, small arms and light weapons are truly weapons of mass destruction.
The United Nations conspiring with the majority of its members to do what they've already done to their own citizens. Deny you your firearm freedom.
In New York, right here in our own shores, we've got a Trojan horse. They want to set U.S. firearms policy. They want to take the decision away from the U.S. electorate and undermine our Constitution.
That's really their ultimate agenda, to bring the United States down from the pinnacle of freedom to simply being another one of these socialist states where the government controls everything.
And just who are these gun grabbers? Countries like Japan.
We strictly punish and control the possession and the use of small arms by civilians.
Britain and Australia.
Firearm owners in Australia must also demonstrate a genuine reason for ownership.
The Netherlands.
It's my firm conviction that the illicit trade cannot be tackled without involving the legal arms trade.
And Canada, led by its former Minister of Justice, Alan Rock.
Registration is the cornerstone of the entire strategy.
Alan Rock is now Canada's voice at the United Nations. His anti-gun agenda is now front and center at the world stage. That's scary.
Scary because the United Nations continues to get away with what it does best.
It's a stealth operation.
Secretly scheming behind closed doors to outlaw your guns.
We must not wait until 2006.
Accountable to no one.
People don't get elected to the UN. And that's the really scary thing. How the hell do you get rid of a UN bureaucrat?
These are the biggest human rights violators in the world, and they're trying to tell people in the United States that we shouldn't have certain civil liberties.
But the UN is not pushing its agenda alone. There's a propaganda machine working every day, targeting the NRA and gun ownership as evil. It's called IANSA, the International Action Network on Small Arms.
This is not about military small arms. This is not about rocket launchers.
What they're really after is my Winchester hunting rifle.
Just log on to IANSA's website, and you'll see it's made up of more than 500 anti-gun NGOs, or non-governmental organizations.
They are absolutely awesome in terms of the power they have.
Power and a plot that is being engineered right here in London, in that building behind me where IANSA is headquartered. Imagine, nearly 230 years after the American Revolution, there are still forces at work here on British soil, determined to trample on your freedoms.
These people believe that ultimately they know how to live your life a heck of a lot better than you do.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Peters. But the plot gets even thicker. The woman who heads up IANSA, Rebecca Peters, led the gun ban movement in Australia.
It's time for tough gun laws.
Gun owners forced to surrender their firearms to the saw blade, scrap heap, and blast furnace. Now, Rebecca Peters is determined to do the same to American gun owners. We phoned Miss Peters here at her office and also emailed her requesting an interview, but she never called us back.
Rebecca Peters is like a live hand grenade with a pin almost out. She is an extremely dangerous person.
Dangerous not only because of what she's done, but because of who she knows.
She is good at getting funding, and funding is the key.
Working for gun hater and billionaire George Soros' Open Society Institute, Rebecca has secured a seemingly endless supply of money for the UN's global gun control agenda.
The pro-gun forces are outnumbered, outspent, 20 to 30 to 1. It's huge.
We have thus far contributed $1.87 million US.
The amount of funding that they're receiving from governments around the world is absolutely staggering.
Britain, one of the biggest. After doing some probing, we found out it gave a $2 million grant in 2001 to IANSA through Britain's Global Conflict Prevention Pool's Small Arms Strategy. With titles like that, you can see why the money trail is impossible to trace.
I don't know if 10 bloodhounds searching this stuff out with 100 accountants can find it.
In fact, you probably didn't know UNICEF is a partner in all of this.
Think of the little kid who showed up at your door on Halloween with a UNICEF box. Would you say no? But it's also an instrument to take away your firearms.
So the U.S. taxpayers get to pay for a lot of this trash that comes out of the UN to ban what really is a human right.
But UN supporters like Amnesty International don't see it that way.
The US citizens do not have a blanket right to use these weapons as they feel fit.
They think gun owners are primitives who have to be brought into the modern world.
And attorney Mark Benenson should know. He was the former chairman for the American branch of Amnesty International. His cousin founded the organization in England in 1961.
I recall how horrified they were when they found out that I was a life member of the National Rifle Association. The Brits were paralyzed with dismay, and they didn't know what to do about it.
But Mark insists that what they're doing now is not the answer to a safer world.
Not at all. I think it will be a safer world for tyrannical governments, and a safer world for the criminals who don't give up their firearms. It certainly will not be a safer world for ordinary people.
England and Australia have already proven that. Their gun bans have backfired, crime skyrocketed, and innocent victims left defenseless.
Sure, the government's banned private ownership. It hasn't stopped the criminals, no way. Not in any shape or form.
There's a crock, it's making no difference whatsoever. I mean, the people in the street, they're going to get their guns anyway. No problem.
Facts that don't matter, because many countries are already enforcing the UN's agenda.
Canada is leading the charge on this beyond any doubt whatsoever. They even have committees in Ottawa specifically set up to implement the United Nations gun control programs.
Our government won't tell us what they're planning. What they've said carte blanche is that these UN regulations have got to be included in our national legislation. I think it's a very dangerous situation.
A program of action is a beginning, not an end in itself. Implementation will be the true test.
The ultimate goal? An international treaty that would be binding.
Unlike a law, unlike a statute which can be made today and changed tomorrow, an international treaty is forever.
If it wasn't for the NRA's presence at the United Nations, everything would have been lost years ago.
Make no mistake, this treaty will snuff out the Second Amendment if the anti-gun forces succeed in electing an anti-gun president and an anti-gun Senate.
The United Nations is as much a threat to our right to keep and bear arms in this country as is Handgun Control Inc. or George Soros. Their agenda is very dangerous, it is very clear, and it is very sinister.
But on that day, when a treaty is ratified, your gun rights, guaranteed by the Constitution, will be gone.
This is not an issue only for gun owners. It's an issue for everybody who believes in our Constitution and democratic governance.
You need to go to your congressmen and to your senators and tell them that in no uncertain terms the United States government should not back the United Nations programs.
They're treading on dangerous ground, and you cannot let your guard down ever.
Let there be no doubt. Dictators around the world hate the United States because the United States is free. They're scared of your guns and they're going to come and get them.
December 15th, 1791. The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, was ratified by the states. The great American experiment was underway. The notion that people would govern themselves was unprecedented. There were no models, no examples to choose from. For the first time, men enacted into law human rights, not just government-given rights. The authors deemed those rights so important, they made a provision to protect those rights so they could never be taken away. The Second Amendment.
A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Time and time again, history replays itself. Unarmed civilizations fall prey to tyrannical leaders. To ensure the balance of power remains in the hands of the people, the framers of the Second Amendment crafted 27 words. One sentence. To succinctly and definitively protect our freedoms from controlling political groups, oppressive religious organizations, or from an abusive government. None of those carefully chosen 27 words are unusual. The sentence is straightforward and crystal clear. There is no mention of limitations or restrictions on the type of arms citizens can carry. There is no mention of gun control. No distinction between sporting use and military use. No language regarding handguns, shotguns, rifles, or even weaponry not yet imagined. What the authors of the Second Amendment did specify is the right of the people, not privilege, to keep and bear arms. Yet, for more than 200 years, those 27 words and their intended meaning have been debated. What's the debate? We, the people, will decide. Here are 6 facts every American must know about the Second Amendment, often referred to as 2A. Fact number 1. The framers of the Bill of Rights believed in God. They fought for the freedom from religious persecution. They believed the right to self-defense is a fundamental God-given right that existed long before the creation of any government. In fact, written documents pertaining to self-preservation predate the Second Amendment by thousands of years. Reference to the right to freedom from violent harm and the right to self-defense is found in the Torah and Christian Bible in Exodus 22 verse 2. In Jewish law, the Talmud states, if someone comes to kill you, arise quickly and kill him. Roman Catholic doctrine has long asserted,
someone who defends his life is not guilty of murder, even if he is forced to deal his aggressor a lethal blow.
Protestant theologian Samuel Rutherford writes in his 1644 publication Lex Rex,
because no king or civil power can take away nature's birthright of self-defense from any man or a community of men.
Even the Declaration of Independence, written 15 years before the Second Amendment was ratified, clearly states,
all human beings are endowed with certain unalienable rights, and that governments are created to protect those rights.
So, what exactly is an unalienable right? A right that cannot be transferred or taken away. Fact number 2.
The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
The language of the Second Amendment prohibits the federal government from infringing on the rights of the people. As clear as the First Amendment's language of prohibiting Congress from infringing on the right of the people to religious expression, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press, the Second Amendment is also clearly a protector of rights. Former Texas legislator Dr. Susanna Hupp knows infringement firsthand. Her parents were brutally gunned down in a Texas cafeteria by a lone gunman.
Reported subject shot 15 shots into
the only thing that the gun laws did that day in Texas was keep people like me from being able to protect myself and my family.
Due to a Texas state law prohibiting the carrying of firearms, the handgun that may have saved her parents' lives remained in her car.
As odd as this may sound to you, I wasn't angry at the madman that did this. But I was mad as hell at my legislators because they had legislated me out of the right to protect myself and my family.
Fact number 3.
A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state.
The Second Amendment refers to a well-regulated militia. The right of the people to form citizen militias was unquestioned by the founders. Alexander Hamilton, in the Federalist Papers number 28, expressed,
"When a government betrays the people by amassing too much power and becoming tyrannical, the people have no choice but to exercise their original right of self-defense, to fight the government."
In the Federalist Papers number 46, James Madison, the father of the Bill of Rights, argues,
"The ultimate authority resides in the people, and that if the federal government got too powerful and overstepped its authority, then the people would develop plans of resistance and resort to arms."
Some interpret today's National Guard as the well-regulated militia, but the founders opposed anything but a small national military.
There are some people that think that that phrase in the Second Amendment has an entirely different meaning.
The phrase well-regulated refers to a well-trained, prepared, and disciplined citizens' militia.
They seem to think that it means just the state National Guard, and they don't know their history. That's just not true.
The phrase was in common use in 1791 and for more than a century afterwards. The Oxford English Dictionary from that time period defines well-regulated as something that was calibrated correctly, functioning as expected. Fact number 4.
A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people.
Further evidence that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state does not refer to the National Guard is supported by recent research. The writing style of the late 18th century legal documents typically began with a preamble. The purpose of the preamble was to state a purpose, not a limitation. New Hampshire's Constitution, written in 1784, begins with a preamble. "The liberty of the press is essential to the security of freedom in a state. It ought therefore to be inviolably preserved." The Constitution has a preamble.
"We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic trade."
The Bill of Rights has a preamble. "The conventions of a number of the states, having at the time of their adopting the Constitution, expressed a desire in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added." Since a preamble states a purpose,
a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people.
The well-regulated militia only reinforces the importance of the individual right to keep and carry arms.
The Second Amendment, when it really comes down to it, I believe it has two primary meanings. One is the obvious ability for me to be able to protect myself and my family from bad guys. But there's another meaning that the founders put in place that I think is absolutely vital to our way of life in this country. It's the ability for all of us out here to be able to protect ourselves from a government that could become tyrannical.
Fact number 5. Before the war between the states, some states enacted laws that made it illegal for slaves and freed African Americans to possess firearms. In the infamous Dred Scott case, The Supreme Court ruled in 1857 that people of African ancestry could not claim U.S. citizenship, essentially taking away the right of African Americans to own a gun. In truth, armed slaves would be able to retaliate against their owners. Ironically, even though the framers of the Second Amendment feared becoming slaves to their government, some were tragically willing to permit slavery. Now that slavery is abolished, all citizens of all races should enjoy the Second Amendment's legal protection. Fact number 6. Over the past 60 years, the interpretation of the term well-regulated militia has come under fire from the Federal Circuit Courts of Appeal and many lower court judges. Those judges have wrongly ruled that the right to keep and bear arms doesn't apply to individuals, but have wrongly interpreted militia to mean the National Guard. But the words well-regulated militia had a far different meaning at the time the Second Amendment was written. In today's world, well-regulated is associated with intense government regulation. At the time the Second Amendment was drafted, the term didn't need to be defined. Colonial militias had been in existence for 150 years. With the exception of millers, ferrymen, and slaves, every adult male was required to join. It was your duty to report for service 4 to 6 times a year. You were required to have your own musket, bayonet, ammunition, and knapsack. If you were unable to supply your own firearm, the militia would provide you with one. Militias were well organized, well regulated, with the men reporting to an appointed captain. Not only did you have the right to own a firearm, it was your duty. Although the Constitution gave Congress the power to raise and support a temporary army, the framers feared a standing army after the Revolutionary War. The overriding purpose of the Second Amendment in guaranteeing the right of the people to keep and bear arms was to maintain a check on the standing army. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, meant ultimate power must be in the hands of the people. The Second Amendment is very specific about this. It is the right of the people, not the states, to keep and bear arms. Recently, the Supreme Court confirmed this view in the District of Columbia versus Heller, finding the right to keep and bear arms an individual right held by the people, not a collective right, as it's been interpreted previously. The court concluded,
Americans have an individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia, and to use that arm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home.
Without a doubt, the Supreme Court decision is a victory. Portions of the court document affirm the facts. The individual right to self-defense. Individual rights shall not be infringed. The correct interpretation of a well-regulated militia. But other portions of that same court document contradict the facts.
Like most rights, the Second Amendment is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose.
Clearly, the controversy is not over. The decision speaks from both sides of the mouth and leaves the door wide open to misinterpretation.
I think it opens it up for all kinds of regulations and registrations of guns that I think do not bode well for the future of the Second Amendment.
Lower courts are likely to interpret the doublespeak and uphold prohibitions on carrying concealed weapons. Lower courts are likely to interpret the doublespeak and uphold laws imposing conditions and restrictions on the sale of firearms. Lower courts are likely to interpret the doublespeak and uphold bans on dangerous and unusual weapons, which could include any weapon the court wants it to be. The debate over the Second Amendment is far from over. Ultimately, we, the people, must decide what's more important, our unalienable rights or what the Supreme Court decides are our rights. So what is it every American should know? Gun control laws have been in existence for hundreds of years. Gun control infringes on individual rights that have been in existence for thousands of years. Gun control is necessary when one group of people wants to control or dominate another group of people. Gun control is usually popularized by myth.
You know, we constantly hear these myths about gun control out there. There's a myth that gun control saves lives. I'm a perfect example of the fact that that isn't true. There's a myth that we'd be safer with fewer guns. We have to have guns in the right hands. There's a myth that countries with gun control laws have lower crime. There's a myth that carrying concealed weapons leads to higher crime and accident rates. It's not true. And registering guns, in my opinion, it's always the precursor to confiscation, which means that I can't protect myself or my family.
There is much evidence that proves more guns in the hands of more law-abiding citizens actually deters crime and lowers the homicide rate. Registering guns does little to keep guns out of the hands of criminals. Many cities with the strictest gun control laws often have the highest crime rate per capita. When criminals have guns and law-abiding citizens are disarmed, who are the gun control laws really protecting?
It's about rights, and as long as you are exercising your right in a responsible manner, I don't think we should be placing regulations upon how you exercise that right.
We, the people, have the unalienable self-right to defend and protect ourselves. We, the people, have the unalienable individual right to pick up arms to secure a free state. We, the people, have the unalienable right to possess and own any weapon we choose. From muskets to military-style weapons, the Second Amendment protects that right.
One of the great things about the ability to keep and bear arms is that ultimately, as long as we have that ability, ultimately the people will have the power and make the decisions.
U and 2A. Good for the USA.
It's your right, your responsibility, defending life, defending liberty, from kings and tyrants, murderers and thieves. So spread the word till all have heard, one guarantee will keep us free. They put quill to parchment so we'd understand. Keep the power in the people's hands.
Well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
To keep freedom in our country, to keep innocence from harm, the founders gave the answer. Let every man be armed. So spread the word till all have heard. One guarantee will keep us free. They put quill to parchment so we'd always understand. Keep the power
By definition, a slave is a person that is disarmed.
For too long, African Americans have been on the wrong side of the gun. From the racial motivation of slavery to the white supremacy movement to today's escalating black-on-black crime. The politically correct view that a disarmed black community is a safe community is only safe for those who seek control.
The black community went from being disarmed, being mistreated, being enslaved because of a lack of access to guns, ultimately went through a period of saying, aha, we have the right to bear arms, we're going to make sure it's respected, to a period where now the gun is the main tool of maintenance of the narco economy, which is the only economy in the African American community.
400 years of injustice. 400 years of being on the wrong side of the gun. It's time for change.
Why is the gangbanger who has the Saturday night special in his pocket given more rights than the average everyday citizen? Even though he was illegally armed, he has a right to defend himself, and you have not the ability to defend yourself.
So if the law says that I can't buy a certain gun, that if I can't carry a gun a certain way, I abide by that because I'm law-abiding. But the criminals are the ones that carry, buy any type of guns that they want, and are empowered.
The basic right of every American is the right to self-defense. Take away that right, and the individual is powerless.
It's not unusual for America in its long history to disarm or seek to disarm undesirable populations.
Gun control laws have kept African Americans in their place for hundreds of years. From the earliest days of slavery up until the mid-1800s, blatantly written gun control laws prohibited slaves and freed slaves from owning firearms.
Be it further enacted that if any Negro shall presume to carry arms whatsoever, he shall be whipped with 21 lashes.
With the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, African Americans were given the right to bear arms. But new laws were written in such a way to exclude blacks from purchasing guns.
The greatest service the authorities can render the city now is to disarm every Negro, search every Negro house, and arrest everyone who is...
Inexpensive handguns were banned, or high taxes were imposed to keep guns out of the financial reach of a mostly poor black community.
There's been various statutes throughout every state that had sizable African American populations after slavery to restrict, through black codes, the ability for blacks to be armed.
In 1941, Florida Supreme Court Justice Buford declared the original 1893 Florida Gun Control Act was passed with the purpose of disarming Negro laborers. The statute was never intended to be applied to the white population. In the 1960s, when armed blacks took to the streets in the race riots in Los Angeles, Newark, and Chicago, the laws were once again rewritten. In a futile attempt to curb the violence, Congress passed the 1968 Gun Control Act. Public outcry for the restrictions of guns after the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy hid the true purpose of the legislation.
It was Robert Sherrill writing on the 1968 legislation who stated that it was really an attempt to restrict arms for black people.
Championed by Senator Thomas Dodd and signed into law by President Johnson, the 68 Gun Control Act used shrewdly crafted language to give the authorities control to dictate who could and who could not own a firearm and what types of firearms Americans can own.
Thomas Dodd from Connecticut, a Connecticut Yankee, goes to the Library of Congress and gets the actual gun act that the Nazis had passed in 1938, and he has it translated into English.
The 68 Gun Control Act was written and in some cases almost copied word for word from the same laws the Nazis used in 1938 to control undesirable populations in Hitler's Germany. Both documents categorize and restrict firearms to certain individuals. Both documents are based on racial fear.
And so they take this document and they use it to draft legislation to start requiring more licensing and more constriction of the right to keep and bear arms.
When I found out what the restrictions were, I was very surprised. Each town, each police chief has the discretion of whether to give a license or not. There is just not one set rule. It seems that a lot of black people, and especially young black men, are held to a higher standard. Maybe you have a drunk driving record, and that would be enough to disqualify you, where legally it's not. It's not a felony conviction. Whereas maybe somebody from the suburbs that's white and maybe from a more influential family would have the same exact record as you do, but would not be denied. It's kind of subtle discrimination.
It seems unthinkable today that legislation is still being written to keep minorities in their place, but it is. Purchasing a firearm requires the applicant to fill out a federal form to verify their race. Restrictive gun laws, gun bans, warrantless searches of public housing, and the confiscation of firearms in major cities continue to deprive minorities of their right to protect and defend themselves.
Violence is increasing. The number of gun-related deaths is increasing yearly. So it should be rather obvious that the gun laws are not working because things are not getting better. They're making more and more laws, and it's getting worse.
Gun control has not worked. The federal government's own Centers for Disease Control can't show conclusive evidence that reducing guns reduces violence. Yet, these facts are dismissed. Historically, more guns in the hands of decent, law-abiding citizens has had the opposite effect. In 1964, the desegregation of Jonesboro, Louisiana High School was threatened by local authorities with fire hoses. 4 armed black men arrived with loaded shotguns. Without firing a shot, the mob dispersed and the authorities retreated. The students entered the school without incident. Those men were members of the Deacons for Defense, an armed citizens militia founded in Jonesboro, Louisiana. The Deacons were everyday citizens who by 1965 had organized into more than 50 chapters throughout the South in self-defense from the Ku Klux Klan.
In 1964, down in Louisiana, there were all types of demonstrations going on by freedom riders. Many times, the demonstrations would be met by armed white resistance. People were dying and being shot and intimidated because they were unarmed. And basically, because they were unarmed, they were also being denied the right to vote.
The Deacons protected civil rights workers for CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, who were registering voters in Louisiana and Mississippi. They patrolled black neighborhoods and protected black churches where CORE was holding voting rights seminars.
These were regular, everyday people. They were not some paramilitary group. The thing that made them different is they were veterans from the Korean War. They were veterans from World War II. And so they did have the training and they did have the discipline that came from being veterans. Once the Klansmen and the white citizen consular and the deputy sheriff that was wearing the sheet at night learned that these deacons for defense would shoot back, then they were not as readily willing to go and pounce upon them in the wee hours of the morning.
Are you going to do something about
Because now they knew that, well, the right to bear arms is providing constitutional rights for these blacks, irrespective of the fact that we want to take away their civil rights. They're fighting on solid ground.
The effectiveness of the deacons in deterring violence was so great that Dr. Martin Luther King and Floyd McKissick of CORE hired the deacons to protect the marchers from Klan aggression in the 1966 March Against Fear.
The very effect of armed resistance in the name of civil rights is what really cast a new enthusiasm into the civil rights movement at a critical time. When the right to bear arms is put in the proper perspective historically, then people will see that the African American community having guns to protect themselves, not from crooked cops and police brutality, but from the culture of drugs and gangs because of a war going on due to the narco economy. And so until we address why are these people armed, why are they shooting, we're not going to be able to create an oasis of redevelopment in the inner cities of America.
Inner city violence is directly related to the black market for illegal drugs, gangs, and drug dealers' turf wars. Today's war on drugs, like alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, share many similarities. Back then, gangsters and bootleggers took to the streets to protect their territories. Homicide rates skyrocketed at the beginning of Prohibition, then took a huge drop after its repeal. Homicide rates again spiked in the early 1970s when President Nixon declared America's war on drugs. More than 35 years later, homicide rates in America's inner cities fluctuate but continue to peak.
We've got to stop the demonization of guns. We've got to encourage law-abiding citizens to arm themselves. And then we have to circulate that information throughout the high crime areas.
Government-published facts speak volumes on the effectiveness of armed citizens. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, 57% of polled felons agree criminals are more worried about meeting an armed victim than they are about running into the police. And, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, the probability of serious injury to women during an attack is 2.5 times greater when they are unarmed.
If women were able to freely carry firearms, there would be less chance of somebody looking at them as a victim. There would be less crime committed against women because a criminal would have to question, is this woman armed?
And, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 550 rapes and 1,100 murders are prevented every day just by showing a gun.
We've got to tell the other side of the story about the hundreds of thousands of times in America where guns are used to stop violence and to stop a crime from being committed.
The police aren't there to protect us. They are there to enforce laws and to arrest criminals once they are criminals, once they have committed a crime. But they're not our personal bodyguards, so I have to do that for myself. No matter how many gun control laws they put into effect, no matter how much they try to restrict it, even if they make it illegal for anybody to own guns, there's going to be a black market.
The community does not get safer when the criminals are told there's no guns available on the part of law-abiding citizens.
People are going to have access to firearms, and the ones that are going to have them are going to be the criminals.
That's like an open season for crime.
It's just like drugs are illegal, and it's a booming business.
History has a habit of repeating itself. Now, As it was back then, politicians and community leaders wrongly claim less guns means less violence. Now, as it was back then, politicians and community leaders wrongly misguide the public in believing that the police and not the community can best provide protection, even though the Supreme Court has publicly stated that state and local governments do not have an obligation to protect citizens from criminal harm.
Guns are a convenient target that disingenuous civil rights leaders and politicians hide behind because they don't want to address the real problem, which is why are all the black youth dropping out of high school and getting guns.
Gun control advocate Sarah Brady, wife of James Brady, whose name is on the 1993 Brady Bill Violence Protection Act, purchased her own son a high-powered rifle.
I think they're misguided, and I think it's a hot issue.
We can always get a bunch of politicians. Well, here's the mayor, here's the alderman, here's the state rep, here's the state, well, here's the president of the Senate. They'll always come out to a press conference where they can put on a shirt and a tie and insinuate that they're there to protect the children. It resonates with voters. It's something that's unquestionable in terms of its merit. And it's something that's patently wrong in terms of the gun control issue, because gun control does not protect the children.
Fact is, a child up to the age of 14 is 4 times more likely to drown, 4 times more likely to die in a fire, and 13 times more likely to die in an auto collision than from a firearm accident.
And that's a message that has to be driven home. What we've got to do is create a solidarity for gun owners that are across the political spectrum, across the racial spectrum. I think that it's high time that blacks, whites, all Americans of goodwill realize that the sacred right to self-defense is at risk in America during the next 4 years in an Obama administration, with Eric Holder going in as Attorney General. Why? Not because they're bad people, but because their philosophy is such that drying up the availability of guns will create greater safety. So I think that what we're looking for is not to be found with gun control, but can only be found when citizens take it upon themselves to protect themselves and their property.
For too long, community leaders, ministers, and politicians have failed to reject the gun control lies. For too long, African Americans have lost control of our neighborhoods. For too long, African Americans have been denied the right to keep and bear arms. For too long, African Americans have been victims of criminals, drug dealers, and dangerous gun control policy. For too long, African Americans have been on the wrong side of the gun.
We have to remain vigilant. We have to challenge the Congress when they try to bring about these new gun control laws, and we have to educate the African American community and other communities in America the racist roots of what gun control is really all about. I believe that productions like this video provide a valuable tool for average, everyday Americans to get the message out to their neighbors, to the people in the community, to the people at their church, to the people at their schools, and to the elected officials that set policy in their areas. I think it's essential that this video is downloaded, copied, emailed, and in every children-oriented social service group that has a strong lobby in the U.S. Congress, I think that we should inundate all of these entities with copies of this video and let them respond to the merit of it based on the facts. And I think that then we can create a forum nationwide where we can keep the pressure on the public policy centers to ensure that the Second Amendment remains an institution for the United States.
Why do so many Jews support gun control?
Part of God's law, as given in the Torah, is that we have a right to defend ourselves.
Have they forgotten their past?
We need to prepare to defend ourselves and defend our lives against those who would hurt us.
Why do so many Jews favor disarming law-abiding citizens?
We have an obligation to defend ourselves. We have a right to defend our property.
Has never again become meaningless.
It's in fact considered to be the most unnatural idea that you would try to take that right away from someone.
Self-preservation is a God-given right, as described in the Torah. Contrary to God's law, many Jewish politicians and influential Jewish leaders promote gun control measures that take away that right. They believe in man's law, the same laws that have denied Jews the ability to arm and defend themselves and their property for thousands of years. The same laws that make it illegal for Jews to follow the commandments in Torah law that obligates Jews to defend themselves.
Historically, the Jewish people have been denied the option of self-defense. Really, it's in America today, it's in Western civilization today that we have the possibility of arming and protecting ourselves. The last time Jews were allowed to own any kind of defensive weaponry was during the time of Bavel, the authors of the Babylonian Talmud. During that period, Jews were allowed to be armed. But from then until today, Jews by and large have been disarmed. And so we have not been prepared to defend ourselves. We are not used to this way of thinking. We are very much used to being the victim.
(1928), pre-Nazi Germany. Street violence breaks out due to political and economic uncertainty. Well-intended citizens with seemingly good intentions, like the seemingly good intentions of Jewish gun control advocates today, passed the 1928 Firearms and Ammunition Control Act, which required all gun owners to register their firearms. The foundation for disaster was laid. Little did they know or foresee the consequences. (1933), Hitler is elected to power. He uses the registered names of firearm owners to his advantage. While loyal party members were excluded, all law-abiding gun owners were put on a list, the same kind of list gun control promoters want in America today. Gun owners were then slowly and systematically disarmed. 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. The Nazis know exactly how many Jews have firearms. They know exactly how little resistance they will encounter. On the 9th of November, the coordinated attack begins. .91 Jews are murdered. 25 to 35,000 are arrested and placed in concentration camps. One day later, an amendment prohibiting Jews from possessing weapons is passed.
Juden ist der Erwerb, der Besitz und das Führen von Schusswaffen und Munition.
Jews are prohibited from acquiring, possessing, and carrying firearms and ammunition.
Waffen und Munition, die sich im Besitz eines
Firearms and ammunition found in a Jew's possession will be forfeited to the government without compensation.
Wer den Vorschriften des Paragraphen 1 vorsetzt,
Whoever willfully or negligently violates the provision will be punished with imprisonment and a fine.
Zuchthaus bis zu 5 Jahren.
This is man's law at work. This is man's law creating situations where people are vulnerable.
When the right to self-defense is denied, God's law is violated. Would history have been rewritten if the SS confronted thousands of armed Jews during the riots of Kristallnacht?
I'm not going to say that things would have been different if they had been armed. I don't know how things would have been. But I am going to say that if they had been armed, they had a chance.
(1940), 400,000 unarmed Polish Jews are herded into the Warsaw Ghetto, awaiting deportation to Nazi extermination camps. 1943. A few hundred Jewish resistance fighters, armed with smuggled-in pistols and rifles, succeed in stopping the well-trained and heavily equipped Nazi forces for a month.
Facing a machine gun, there isn't much that a group of unarmed civilians can possibly do. I don't know what would have been different, and I'm certainly not going to stand here and say the Holocaust wouldn't have happened. I don't know. But I do know that if Jews had not turned in their firearms, if Jews had not registered their guns on Hitler's registry, things would have been different. Could they perhaps have better protected and defended themselves?
Leading up to the War for Israeli Independence, laws were enacted to prohibit the sale of firearms to Jews under the British Mandate for Palestine. An arms embargo was imposed, weapons were confiscated, and Jews, if found with a gun, were arrested and jailed. Once again, seemingly good-intended gun control legislation was enacted as a means to diffuse tension among the Arabs. In exchange, the British promised the Jewish people protection.
This is very much a recurring story. No, the British did not protect the Jewish people, and when the Arab muftis would incite crowds to riot against the Jewish people, the British did very little to stop that.
To defend themselves, the Zionists built secret ammunition factories and kibbutzes. They illegally purchased and hid World War II-issued Nazi Mauser rifles. The swastika was filed off and replaced with the Star of David. Ironically, these weapons later proved decisive in the 1948 War for Independence.
It's ironic, isn't it? We Jews, we sit in America, and most of us don't own guns. Most of us think guns are somehow non-Jewish in some strange way. And yet, we're very proud to see an Israeli soldier carrying an Uzi, an M16, whatever it is, flying a fighter plane. That makes us proud. And yet, in some strange way, it's not for us. These things don't happen here.
Terrorism against Jews is not an ocean apart, and Jewish oppression is not a chapter in the history books. It's alive and well today.
Stop and think here for a minute in this room where we're standing. If an active shooter walked into this room right now, what would happen? Would any of us know what to do? Would any of us have anything at all that we could do about it?
August 10th, 1999.
Inside the area, there still might be something going on, and they're not taking any chances.
Buford Furrow walks into the lobby of the North Valley Jewish Community Center in Granada Hills and unloads 70 shots into the complex. 5 people are wounded, 3 children, a teenaged counselor, and an office worker. June 10th, 2009. 88-year-old white supremacist James von Braun enters the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. and guns down a security guard. October 29th, 2009. A lone teenager opens fire in a Los Angeles synagogue parking lot. 2 men are wounded as they entered the synagogue for morning prayers.
We felt it was important to come together today, not just as Jewish members, but as members of Congress who represent districts across the United States of America.
Now, the Jewish reaction to a lot of this, quite frankly, the knee-jerk liberal reaction to a lot of this, which I hope will cease to be synonymous with the Jewish reaction.
We've seen gunmen go into daycare centers and shoot children.
This is not just an issue directed at American Jews.
Is that we can prevent these sorts of things with what is commonly known as gun control. We can take guns off the streets and these things will stop happening.
This simply cannot happen and cannot continue to happen.
Gun control laws in California and Washington, D.C. are some of the most stringent in the nation. As an ex-convict, it was illegal for Buford Furrow to own a firearm. Yet, when he arrived at the Jewish Community Center, he had 5 rifles in his possession. As a convicted felon, it was illegal for James von Braun to own a firearm. Yet, when he entered the Holocaust Museum, he openly carried a rifle. Gun control laws only affect law-abiding citizens. Gun control laws only aid criminals by keeping self-defense weaponry out of the hands of their intended victims.
It is my opinion that every Jew, and I mean every Jew, should know how to shoot a gun. And Jews who are physically and psychologically fit to do so should own guns, should train in using them properly for defensive purposes, and under appropriate circumstances should even be carrying them.
In an effort to educate people, Rabbi Ben-Dori regularly conducts classes on firearm safety and proper use.
This is why you always treat the gun as if it's loaded, period.
The goal, to understand and respect firearms for what they are, a tool for defensive purposes.
In my experience, most Jews associate guns with violence simply because we have no experience with guns as Jews in this country. And our historical memory of guns is being at the wrong end of the barrel.
Many Jews see themselves as victims. They see the world as a scary and threatening place in which they are helpless. According to psychiatrist Sarah Thompson, the reason for this behavior is an instinctive defensive mechanism called projection. Defense mechanisms psychologically protect people from feelings they cannot consciously accept. The fear of hate crimes, bigotry, or the Holocaust. These intolerable feelings are then projected onto an inanimate object, such as a gun, so the projector believes the gun itself commits a crime. Victimization also gives a group identity. By claiming victim status, members of a group receive special treatment. They believe there's no alternative but to remain a victim forever. Therefore, they must count on the group to speak on their behalf and protect them. Groups like the Anti-Defamation League, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Violence Policy Center, or the Million Mom March rely on their membership's victim status. It's not in their best interest to promote self-defense, even though the research clearly demonstrates firearm ownership is the most effective way to protect law-abiding citizens and their families. Many of these groups promote the popular belief less guns means less violence. To some, this assumption seems to make sense, but the evidence proves just the opposite. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, every day 550 rapes and 1,100 murders are prevented just by the intended victim showing a gun. That's over 600,000 people each year that stop a serious crime before it happens without ever firing a shot. In a firearms study of polled felons, the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics also found that 57% of felons agree criminals are more worried about meeting an armed victim than they are about running into the police. If self-defensive weapons are banned, how will citizens protect themselves? Are the police equipped to protect citizens at a moment's notice? The average response time to a 911 call is 10 minutes or more. Every perpetrator knows this and plans their attacks accordingly. Can the police actually adjust their priorities to provide added security during Jewish holidays? Even the Supreme Court has ruled that state and local governments do not have an obligation to protect citizens from criminal harm. So, can the police really protect us? In London, where handguns have been banned since 1997, the London Evening Standard reports that 2 years following the ban, handgun crimes rose by 40%. Violent crime in the United Kingdom has increased 44%, from 618,000 in 1998 to more than 879,000 crimes in March 2010. The British government and police once again claimed they could protect the people. The Australian gun ban of 1997 confirms similar results. While armed assault rates and armed murder rates remain the same, robbery and armed robbery actually rose from 1997 through 2002, then leveled off to the same rates as before the gun ban. A study recently published by the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy finds nations with stringent anti-gun laws have higher murder rates than those that do not. In Western Europe, Norway has one of the highest rates of gun ownership. It also has the lowest murder rate. In contrast, Luxembourg has one of the highest murder rates, but handguns are banned. In Russia, where private firearms were banned under communist rule, the study shows the murder rate is 4 times higher than in the U.S. and 20 times higher than Norway. So how can this be? If the belief that less guns means less violence is true, then murder rates should decline. The data proves it doesn't. Many anti-gun advocates are quick to point out that nations that have banned firearms have fewer murders by handguns. They dismiss the fact that the overall murder rate remains consistent. They dismiss the fact that it is the human being, not the weapon, that commits murder. Currently, the United Nations is drafting an arms trade treaty to impose strict worldwide controls on firearms. They publicize armed violence takes the lives of 740,000 people each year. This is an exaggerated claim which they use to influence policymakers. Of that 740,000 number, they allege 490,000 are non-war-related homicides, and 250,000 deaths are directly or indirectly due to war. According to a recent study, those alleged figures are too high and are out of line with other research. The UN claims the figures are based on global homicide rates and statistical models they refuse to publish. Until thoroughly documented data is made public, the UN's claim is unsubstantiated. The Arms Trade Treaty demands worldwide gun registration and the destruction of all small arms. The treaty is backed and funded by IANSA, the International Action Network on Small Arms. IANSA is an international non-governmental organization that is financially supported by 120 countries, including Great Britain, Brazil, Canada, and Japan. IANSA played a significant role in the Australian gun ban legislation in 1997. The group has publicly stated they oppose the use of firearms for self-defense. IANSA is at war with Jewish law. Sadly, the organization is largely funded by billionaire hedge fund manager and Holocaust survivor George Soros. From 1979 to 2007, Soros's foundation, the Open Society Institute, has donated billions of dollars to promote his anti-American radical leftist worldview agenda. They support the election of political candidates who share their view. They subscribe to the notion of bringing American foreign policy under the control of the United Nations. And they have funneled tens of millions of dollars annually to gun control organizations in worldwide support of stricter gun control measures. Should IANSA and the UN succeed with their global gun control agenda, a non-elected body of bureaucrats would take the issue of gun control out of the hands of the U.S. electorate and undermine the Constitution. What's at stake is the Second Amendment. The language of the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights is straightforward and very clear. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
This right to keep and bear arms is not something given to us by our government. It's a pre-existing right, as in a God-given right. And in fact, we find this right in the Torah.
The framers of the Constitution believed in God. They fought for the freedom from religious persecution. They firmly believe the right to self-defense is a fundamental God-given right, and the government's role is to protect that right.
In terms of supporting Second Amendment, we should be supporting elected officials who advocate gun rights. We should be advocating gun rights ourselves, and we should advocate for the repeal of the sorts of gun control measures that we have seen throughout the world and throughout history have severe consequences to the people that were subject to those restrictions.
Laws that protect rights must be fought for and preserved. No one would deny preserving the right to free speech or freedom of religious expression. And yet, many are willing to give up the protector of those rights, the Second Amendment. They are willing to give up the right of personal defense in exchange for security by someone who promises protection.
I specifically looked into this issue of personal defense. What are my Torah obligations? And what does the Torah have to say about firearms ownership, about gun ownership, about being prepared for such situations? And what I found was that Torah law is very, very clear, that God has an expectation that we will defend ourselves. We're required to do so by Torah law, and we are required to be prepared to defend ourselves against reasonable threats.
In Rambam, Laws of Robbery, Chapter 9, Paragraph 7 says, "One who breaks into a home, whether by day or night, if the homeowner or anyone else kills him, there is no crime." In fact, permission is given to anyone to intervene and kill the invader by any means necessary.
So, according to Maimonides, criminal trespass on your front lawn is already enough to justify the use of force to get this person off of your property. You need not wait until the person is inside of the home.
In Leviticus 19, verse 16, it is written, "Do not stand idly by your brother's blood."
Rashi says, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. For example, if you see him dying and you can help. You are forbidden from standing by and doing nothing. In Jewish law, we have very few rights. We have obligations. One of our obligations in Jewish law is to defend and protect and save and rescue the innocent. Lo ta'amod al dam re'acha. If you see another person in trouble and you can help, you are required to help.
Contrary to the opinion of some Jews and Christians alike, the interpretation of the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," does not forbid the use of deadly force for defensive purposes. The original Hebrew translation of the sixth commandment is as follows: "Thou shalt not murder." The two words kill and murder have dramatically contrasting meanings.
There are certain areas that are strikingly different between Jewish law and secular law, or between God's law and man's law. So, for example, where I live in New Jersey, if there is someone inside of my home, I'm allowed to use a gun against that person. If there's someone inside my neighbor's home, and I went with my gun to protect my neighbor's home, I would be arrested and put on trial for that. In Jewish law, I have an obligation to help. And if I can help, but I don't, I am held culpable by God Himself. He holds me responsible. I answer to a higher authority. We as Jews have a choice. We can live by God's law, or we can die by man's law.
In regard to self-defense, many supposedly prominent Jewish politicians and civic leaders have chosen to oppose God's law in favor of man's law.
I think the first thing that we have to do is recognize where this gun control is coming from. We need to recognize the laws that are a problem, and we need to identify the people that are behind them.
California Senator Dianne Feinstein opposes God's law. In a 60-minute interview on the topic of gun control, she said this: "If I could have gotten 51 votes in the Senate of the United States for an outright ban, picking up every one of them, Mr. and Mrs. America, turn them all in, I would have done it." Her statement contradicts her own actions, as she once had a concealed weapons permit to carry a handgun in California. New Jersey Senator Frank Lautenberg opposes God's law. He and Senator Feinstein voted in favor of firearms confiscation during national disasters, such as Hurricane Katrina, a time when self-defense is most needed from criminals and roving gangs of looters. In 2007, Senator Lautenberg voted against the Vitter Amendment, a bill that protects U.S. citizens from gun registration laws imposed by international groups or agencies, including the United Nations. Rabbi Eric Yoffe of the Union for Reform Judaism opposes God's law. At a Million Mom March rally, he stated, "Controlling guns is not only a political matter, it is a solemn religious obligation." But he provides no Jewish sources to back up his assertion. Child Holocaust survivor and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, Abraham Foxman, opposes God's law. Given the evidence of his own disarmed people suffering at the hands of the Nazis, his support for gun control contradicts the Torah tradition he claims to honor. The ADL, which monitors and tracks anti-Semitic activity around the world, favors a disarmed populace. The ADL fought in support of Washington, D.C.'s ban on the possession of firearms in the landmark 2008 Supreme Court decision, District of Columbia versus Heller, and the 2010 follow-up ruling in McDonald versus the City of Chicago. In those cases, the court upheld that the Second Amendment guarantees the individual right to keep and bear arms, and that right extends fully to state and local laws. The ADL argued against it. Contrary to Torah law, the ADL contends that states should retain the right to keep guns out of the hands of its citizens. Amazingly, the ADL supports a U.S. gun control law that was rooted in Nazi law, the Gun Control Act of 1968. This federal law was authored by Senator Thomas Dodd of Connecticut and signed by President Johnson. Like the 1938 Nazi Weapons Act, the U.S. Gun Control Act of 1968 dictated who could and who could not own a firearm and put restrictions on the types of guns Americans can own. Prior to writing the bill, on July 2, 1968, Senator Dodd requested a translation of the 1938 Nazi weapons law from the Library of Congress. A comparison of the language in the final bill shows some of it was copied, word for word, from the same laws the Nazis used in 1938. The same laws that put Europeans on a list 30 years earlier were now being used to put Americans on a list. The same laws that were approved by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. The staunch anti-gun senator from New York, Charles Schumer, also opposes God's law. He has sponsored many bills to ban military-appearing weapons and to impose a waiting period on handgun sales. Although Mr. Schumer is opposed to his constituents owning firearms, he himself enjoys pheasant hunting with his colleague in the House, Ben Nelson of Nebraska. California Congressman Henry Waxman opposes God's law. He absurdly made this statement in 2008. If someone is so fearful that they are going to start using their weapons to protect their rights, it makes me very nervous that these people have weapons at all. In contrast to Mr. Waxman's statement, the great liberal Jewish Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis wrote, "We shall have lost something vital and beyond price on the day when the state denies us the right to resort to force." It is evident. The rights and liberties afforded to Americans through the Constitution are under attack by reckless politicians and misguided leaders. Why would Mr. Waxman be nervous about people protecting their rights, unless he was trying to take away those rights? Is he embracing God's laws or man's laws?
Let me give you an example of how absurd some of man's laws are. I live in New Jersey, so here is my New Jersey firearms identification card. My New Jersey firearms identification card I have to show anytime I want to even hold a gun in a store or buy any ammunition. Now, this has my name on it, my address, all sorts of interesting things, and my fingerprint. I don't get fingerprinted when I go to buy something, and no one exactly checks this for identification before selling me ammunition. What's the purpose of this? The purpose of this is to have my name on a list so that the state police know that I'm a gun owner. There's no other reason to do this. Why do they need to have such a list? This is the kind of gun control, this is the kind of man's law that begins to cause the trouble that we're talking about.
What seems impossible replays itself over and over again. Those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Never again means vigilance. Is our generation keeping watch? Americans have to decide. They can repeat the past or work to eliminate those laws that destroy our rights.
Well, we have a principle in Jewish law. The principle is dina de malchuta dina, which essentially means that you follow the law of the land. Now, following the law of the land has its limits. You don't follow the law of the land if it forces you to violate Torah law. So when you start talking about things like gun control here in the States, Torah law does not say go out and break the law. What it says is that's an unjust law. Go out and do everything you can to change it.
The time for change is now. Americans can no longer be complacent. Political and economic uncertainty is once again on the rise. Hate and terrorism have infiltrated our borders like never before, while America's rights are being challenged and denied by a new worldwide order. Across the U.S., dozens of terrorist compounds operated by a group called Muslims of America are training followers in guerrilla warfare, hijacking cars, kidnapping, explosives, and weapons training, as seen in this group's captured home video footage. Hate crimes on the website Filthy Jewish Terrorists declare a genocide should be perpetuated against the Jewish populations of North America and Europe. Holocaust deniers spread their influence. The Holocaust was a deliberate Jewish conspiracy to advance the interests of Jews. The Department of Homeland Security has listed every synagogue and every Jewish school as a primary target for Islamic jihadists and Aryan nation extremists. Can Jewish Americans stand idly by their brothers' blood, even as primary targets? Americans still have the individual right to keep and bear arms to secure a free state. But the future is uncertain. Those rights are under attack. Those rights are being challenged by local and national politicians, by advocacy groups, the media, the United Nations, and anti-freedom extremists. Those rights are being tested by unelected federal judges, by state courts, and by naive politicians who wrongly believe less guns means less violence, and the belief that authorities can best protect the public.
Jews and all good people need to be taking action to stop the kinds of tyranny that we see in the world. Whether it's the tyranny of terrorist attacks or it's the tyranny of rule of government, either way we should be taking action to stop it and prevent it.
It's time to act. The choice is clear.
That's the choice you have. The choice is to live by God's law or die by man's law.